Modern food systems are built on an assumption so familiar that it feels natural. Vegetables are temporary. You plant them, harvest them, and they disappear. Their disappearance is expected. Beds empty. Soil is turned. Next season begins from nothing. This cycle feels ancient, almost biological, as if food has always behaved this way. But for most of history, it did not. Medieval food security was not built on crops that died every year. It was built on the opposite idea, that the best food systems were the ones that stayed. Vegetables were chosen not because they produced quickly, but because they endured. A plant that returned on its own was not an oddity. It was the standard against which others were judged. This way of thinking emerged from necessity, not ideology. Medieval life was uncertain in ways difficult to imagine today. Weather was unpredictable. Wars disrupted trade. Disease could remove entire labor forces in a single season. In such conditions, restarting food production every year was not just inefficient, it was dangerous. Survival depended on systems that could function even when people could not intervene. That is why permanence mattered more than yield. A vegetable that fed people for 20 years from a single planting was more valuable than one that produced heavily for one season and vanished. Time itself was part of the calculation. Labor invested once and returned many times over was a form of stored security. In this context, gardens were not seasonal activities. They were infrastructure. Like wells or grain stores, they were expected to endure. Beds were laid out permanently. Soil was protected rather than constantly disturbed. Plants were allowed to settle, mature, and claim space. Over time, gardens became more productive and easier to manage, not less. Perennial vegetables formed the backbone of this system. Their roots remained alive underground through winter. When spring arrived, food appeared automatically. No seed purchase, no replanting, no gamble on timing. This reliability reduced risk in a world where risk was constant. Annual crops still existed, but they were not the foundation. They filled gaps and took advantage of good years. If they failed, the system did not collapse because something else always returned. Food security came from continuity, not precision. This approach shaped expectations. Medieval farmers did not expect food systems to demand more work each year. They expected the opposite. A well-designed garden should reduce labor over time. Effort was meant to compound, not reset. If a system required constant rebuilding, it was seen as flawed. Modern agriculture reversed this logic so completely that its absence is rarely noticed. Today, exhaustion is normal. Soil depletion is expected. Crop loss is accepted. Replacement is routine. When these conditions repeat across generations, they stop looking like choices and start looking like reality. But they are not reality. They are design. Nature itself favors permanence. In stable ecosystems, perennial plants dominate. They anchor soil, regulate moisture, and create long-term balance. Annual plants thrive where disturbance is constant. Medieval agriculture aligned with this pattern. Modern systems often work against it. The disappearance of perennial vegetables did not happen because they failed biologically. It happened because food systems were redesigned around speed, uniformity, and turnover. A plant that stayed in the ground for decades did not fit neatly into systems that measured success one season at a time. Over generations, this redesign erased memory. Knowledge stopped being passed down because it was no longer needed. Plants stopped being grown because they were no longer promoted. What was not practiced was forgotten. Within a few centuries, vegetables that once fed Europe for hundreds of years became obscure, then invisible. This erasure was quiet. No bans, no laws, just neglect. And neglect, over time, is enough. Understanding this is essential because it reframes the entire story. Medieval food security was not primitive or inefficient. It was deliberately structured around endurance. Vegetables were chosen because they refused to disappear. Gardens were designed to mature rather than restart. Food was designed to last. Once that principle is understood, the question shifts. The issue is no longer whether perennial vegetables work. They did, for centuries. The real question becomes why systems stopped allowing them to matter. And once that question is asked, the modern assumption that food must always begin again starts to look far less natural than it first appeared. To medieval farmers, a garden was not a hobby, a supplement, or a seasonal experiment. It was infrastructure, just as essential as a well, a mill, or a grain store. Its purpose was not to impress, but to endure. Every decision, what to plant, where to plant it, how to maintain it, was shaped by the expectation that the garden must function through uncertainty. This expectation came from lived experience. Medieval Europe faced repeated shocks, harsh winters, crop failures, wars, disease, and disrupted trade. In such a world, food systems could not rely on perfect timing or constant input. They had to work even when people were exhausted, absent, or overwhelmed. The safest systems were those that continued producing with minimal intervention. That is why medieval gardens were designed to be permanent. Beds were not laid out and erased each year. Paths stayed in place. Soil was protected rather than turned endlessly. Plants were allowed to establish deep roots and claim long-term space. Over time, the garden became more stable, not more fragile. Its structure reduced effort rather than increased it. Monastery gardens show this logic most clearly. These were not symbolic green spaces. They were carefully planned systems meant to feed entire communities year after year. Monks documented what worked and what failed, not for a single season, but across generations. Crops that demanded constant replanting or exhausted soil were gradually phased out. Crops that returned reliably were multiplied and preserved. This created a feedback loop. Because gardens persisted, knowledge accumulated. Gardeners learned how plants behaved over long periods, when to harvest lightly, when to let plants rest, how to divide without weakening them. This kind of understanding cannot exist in systems that restart every year. It requires continuity. Labor efficiency was central to this design. Medieval life involved relentless physical work, and unnecessary repetition was avoided whenever possible. A plant that reduced future labor was valued more than one that produced quickly and disappeared. Establishment might take years, but once complete, the system paid that investment back many times over. Seed use reflects this mindset. Seeds were precious, not casually expended to restart entire gardens each spring. They were saved carefully and used strategically. Much propagation happened through division, cuttings, and offsets, methods that preserved reliable traits and reduced risk. A garden built on living continuity did not depend on seed access to survive. Diversity strengthened the system further. Medieval gardens were not monocultures. Perennial vegetables grew alongside annual crops, herbs, fruit trees, and medicinal plants. Each served a role. If one failed, others compensated. This layering spread risk across time rather than concentrating it into a single season. The result was a system that absorbed shocks instead of amplifying them. During famines, monastery gardens often continued producing when surrounding fields failed. Their strength did not come from high yields in good years, but from consistency in bad ones. Reliability mattered more than abundance. Modern agriculture often assumes that progress means greater control, faster cycles, and cleaner resets. Medieval gardeners assumed progress meant fewer interventions over time. A successful system was one that asked less of its caretakers each year, not more. This difference is crucial. The medieval garden was designed to mature. Modern gardens are designed to restart. When perennial vegetables disappeared, it was not because they failed within this system. It was because the system itself was replaced. Gardens stopped being infrastructure and became projects. Food production shifted from endurance to efficiency, from continuity to turnover. Understanding the medieval garden as infrastructure explains why long-lived vegetables were once so common. They were not unusual plants placed into ordinary gardens. They were the logical foundation of a system built to survive instability. Without this context, perennial vegetables seem like curiosities. With it, they appear inevitable. The medieval garden worked because it assumed one simple truth. Food security is not created by speed, but by systems that continue working when conditions are worst. Within the medieval garden system, certain vegetables were not optional additions. They were anchors. These plants carried the weight of food security because they returned reliably, demanded little once established, and continued producing when other crops failed. Their value was not measured in novelty or speed, but in trust. You planted them knowing they would stay. These vegetables shared a defining trait. They were perennial or self-renewing. Their life cycle did not end with harvest. Their roots remained alive underground, storing energy and preparing for the next season. When spring arrived, they emerged without instruction. No seed was required. No gamble was taken. Food simply returned. Asparagus is one of the clearest examples. It required patience at the beginning, often several years before full harvest, but once established it produced spears every spring for decades. Medieval farmers accepted the wait because the reward was permanence. An asparagus bed planted by one generation often fed the next. It provided food early in the year, when winter stores were low and annual crops were not yet growing. That timing alone made it invaluable. Leafy greens followed a similar logic. Before annual spinach became widespread, perennial greens such as Good King Henry were common across Europe. These plants emerged early, produced leaves for much of the growing season, and returned year after year without receding. Their young shoots, mature leaves, and flowering tops all provided food at different times. One plant filled multiple roles, reducing the need for variety through replacement. Flavor crops were just as important to survival as calories. Lovage, a tall perennial herb, returned every year and flavored large quantities of food with minimal harvesting. In an era when imported spices were expensive or unavailable, this mattered. Flavor made limited diets tolerable and helped preserve food. One plant could serve an entire household for years, quietly reducing dependence on trade. Root vegetables anchored another layer of security. Skirret, now largely forgotten, produced clusters of sweet roots that could be harvested selectively. Instead of pulling the entire plant and ending production, gardeners removed some roots and left the rest to regenerate. The plant remained alive in the soil, acting as a living pantry. During winter, roots could be dug as needed, providing fresh food when little else was available. Rhubarb offered a different kind of reliability. Once planted, it became nearly permanent. It tolerated cold, neglect, and poor conditions. Each winter it disappeared above ground, only to return stronger in spring. While initially valued for medicinal use, its edible stalks later became an important food source. A single plant could produce for decades with minimal care. Artichokes demonstrated renewal through knowledge rather than reseeding. Individual plants produced edible buds for several years, then declined. But they also produced offsets, new plants growing from the base. Medieval gardeners divided these and replanted them, effectively resetting the crop without starting over. One original planting could be perpetuated indefinitely, as long as the knowledge of division was maintained. Even aggressive plants played a role. Horseradish spread relentlessly once established. Rather than fighting this trait, medieval gardeners used it. Horseradish thrived in poor soil and neglected corners, producing pungent roots year after year. Any fragment left in the ground could regenerate. In unstable conditions, a plant that refused to die was an asset. What united these vegetables was behavior, not appearance. They returned. They endured. They reduced the need for seeds, labor, and outside inputs. They transformed gardens from seasonal efforts into systems that improved with time. These crops were not rare. They were widespread because they worked. They fed peasants and monks alike, provided security during famine, and softened the impact of bad years. Their presence allowed medieval agriculture to function without constant restarting. When these vegetables anchored food production, replanting every year was unnecessary for much of the diet. Seeds were used selectively, not compulsively. Replacement was a tool, not a requirement. Understanding these crops reveals a crucial truth. Medieval food security was not built on abundance alone. It was built on reliability. The vegetables that anchored survival were chosen because they could be trusted to return. Their disappearance was not a biological inevitability. It was a systemic decision. And once these anchors were removed, food systems began to drift toward greater effort, greater dependency, and greater fragility. The next chapter confronts that shift directly because these vegetables did not vanish quietly. They were pushed aside by a new way of thinking, one that no longer had room for crops that refused to disappear. The vegetables that anchored medieval food security did not disappear because they failed in the ground. They disappeared because the system around them changed in ways that made their strengths inconvenient. As Europe moved out of the medieval world and into early modern and industrial agriculture, food production stopped being organized around survival and began to revolve around markets. Once that shift occurred, permanence, once the foundation of security, became a problem. In the medieval system, Land was expected to carry memory. A garden improved as it aged. Plants earned their place through reliability. Knowledge accumulated because the system persisted. But as agriculture became increasingly commercial, land was reimagined as something to be reset and reprogrammed each year. Fields needed to be cleared on schedule, replanted on demand, and harvested all at once. Crops had to fit calendars, contracts, and accounting cycles. Perennial vegetables resisted this logic. They occupied land continuously. They matured unevenly. They could not be cleared and replaced at will. From an industrial perspective, they were difficult to standardize. Their value unfolded over decades, while markets demanded results within a single season. A plant that fed people for 20 years did not align with systems that measured success annually. Annual crops, by contrast, fit perfectly. They started and ended on command. Inputs could be calculated precisely. Outputs could be predicted. Most importantly, they created repeat demand. Seeds had to be obtained again. Fertility had to be replaced. Labor had to be reapplied. The system sustained economic activity through repetition, even if it exhausted land and people over time. This is the moment when permanence crossed an invisible line. A vegetable that reduced dependency became economically inconvenient. A garden that improved with age undermined the logic of constant replacement. From the perspective of emerging agricultural markets, this was inefficiency, not because less food was produced, but because fewer transactions occurred. The transition did not require bans or laws. Long-lived vegetables were not outlawed. They were simply excluded. Seed catalogs stopped offering them. Agricultural education stopped teaching their care. Research funding focused on crops that could be bred quickly and replaced easily. What was not supported slowly vanished. Cultural attitudes shifted alongside economics. Waiting began to look like waste. A plant that took several years to reach full production was labeled impractical, regardless of what it delivered over its lifetime. The idea of planting something you might not personally harvest came to feel outdated rather than responsible. Time horizons collapsed from generations to seasons. Language reinforced the change. Long-term systems were described as old-fashioned. High-input, short-cycle systems were called modern. Productivity was measured per season instead of across decades. Under that metric, perennial vegetables could never compete, no matter how much food they provided in total. What makes this shift hard to recognize is that it felt like progress. Faster growth, cleaner fields, greater control. But beneath that appearance, resilience was being traded away. Systems became efficient in good conditions and brittle in bad ones. The buffers that once absorbed shock were removed. The vegetables that built medieval food security did not vanish quietly. They were pushed aside by a new way of thinking, one that no longer valued continuity. Their refusal to reset made them incompatible with a system organized around turnover. In the medieval world, that refusal was a strength. In the modern world, it became a liability. Understanding this shift matters because it reveals a deeper truth. What was lost was not the ability to grow these vegetables, but the willingness to design systems that allow permanence to matter. Once food production stopped valuing endurance, crops that embodied endurance had nowhere to belong. And when permanence no longer fits the system, even the most reliable plants are eventually forgotten. When perennial vegetables disappeared from everyday agriculture, food production did not immediately collapse. Fields still produced. Markets still filled shelves. From the outside, the system looked successful. But beneath that surface, a fundamental change had taken place. Food systems stopped building strength over time and began consuming it instead. What replaced medieval security was not abundance, but fragility disguised as efficiency. The first casualty was resilience. Perennial vegetables acted as anchors. They returned even when planting schedules failed, labor was short, or seasons turned harsh. When those anchors were removed, food production became dependent on precision. A late frost, a missed planting window, or a disrupted supply chain could now wipe out an entire year's work. Stability was traded for timing, and timing is unforgiving. Soil bore the next cost. Long-lived crops protect soil continuously. Their roots hold structure, prevent erosion, and feed microbial life year after year. Annual systems disturb soil repeatedly, clearing, tilling, and replanting with every season. Each disturbance weakens structure and accelerates nutrient loss. Over time, Fertility declines and must be replaced artificially. What had once been maintained biologically became something imported and purchased. Labor demands increased even as tools improved. Perennial systems front-load effort and then reduce it. Annual systems erase progress. Every season requires the same preparation, the same planting, the same correction. Nothing accumulates. Work resets. This repetition was framed as normal, even efficient, but in reality it meant more effort just to maintain the same level of security. Knowledge eroded alongside the soil. Managing perennial vegetables requires long observation, knowing when to divide, when to harvest lightly, when to let plants rest. These skills disappear when replacement becomes the default. Why learn to maintain when you can replace? Over time, understanding was replaced by instructions and experience by packaging. Diversity narrowed as well. Perennial vegetables were often locally adapted, shaped by generations of selection. When agriculture standardized around annual crops, that diversity faded. Uniform systems are easy to manage under ideal conditions, but fail dramatically under stress. Medieval gardens absorbed shock because they were varied. Modern systems require control to survive. Perhaps the most subtle loss was psychological. Perennial systems teach continuity. They show that care accumulates, that time can be an ally. Annual systems teach impermanence. Everything is temporary. Everything must be restarted. Failure becomes normal because it is expected. When collapse is built into the cycle, resilience feels unattainable. Dependency deepened with every season. A system that cannot reproduce itself ties its survival to external inputs. Seeds, fertilizers, replacements, all become necessities rather than options. Food production becomes vulnerable to markets, supply chains, and price shocks. What once provided security now mirrors the instability of the wider economy. This dependency did not arrive through force. It arrived through convenience. Each step felt reasonable. Faster crops, cleaner fields, predictable schedules. But taken together, these choices dismantled a system that had supported Europe for centuries. Replanting became normal not because it worked better, but because it aligned with systems built on turnover and consumption. The irony is that modern agriculture often works harder to achieve less stability. More inputs, more effort, more complexity, yet greater vulnerability. Medieval food systems were not easy, but they were durable. They improved with time. They assumed that today's work should make tomorrow easier. When perennial vegetables were removed, that assumption vanished with them. Starting over every year stopped feeling like a cost and started feeling inevitable. And once that belief took hold, food security became something to manage endlessly rather than something to build. What replaced medieval security was not progress. It was a system that produces abundance only as long as everything goes right, and struggles the moment it does not. The conditions that once made perennial vegetables essential are returning, even if they look different on the surface. Rising costs, unstable climates, exhausted soils, and fragile supply chains are exposing the weaknesses of systems built entirely on annual replacement. What medieval farmers understood intuitively is becoming visible again. Food security is not created by speed or volume alone, but by continuity. Modern food production depends on everything going right at the right time. Seeds must arrive. Inputs must be affordable. Weather must cooperate. Labor must be available. When any one of these fails, the entire system stumbles. Perennial vegetables offer a different kind of reliability. Once established, they do not wait for permission to grow. They return whether markets function or not. In an uncertain world, that independence matters. Soil health is driving much of this reevaluation. Decades of annual disturbance have left many soils compacted, depleted, and biologically weak. The response has often been to increase inputs, but this treats symptoms rather than causes. Perennial crops rebuild soil from below. Their roots remain year-round, feeding microbial life, improving structure, and reducing erosion. They repair what constant restarting breaks. Climate instability amplifies the need for such systems. Irregular frosts, heat waves, droughts, and unpredictable rainfall punish crops that must be planted at precise moments. Perennials absorb these shocks more effectively because they are already established. They do not gamble everything on a narrow window. They persist through disruption rather than collapsing under it. There is also a cultural shift underway. More people are questioning systems that require endless consumption to function. The idea that food production should become easier with time, not harder, is resurfacing. Perennial vegetables align naturally with this mindset. They reward patience. They turn time into an asset instead of a liability. Reintroducing these crops does not require rejecting modern agriculture wholesale. Medieval systems had limits. Labor was demanding. Yields were sometimes lower in the short term. But their core principle, building systems that improve with age, remains sound. Annual crops still have a role, but they do not need to carry the entire burden of food security. Planting even one perennial changes the rhythm of a garden. It creates a foundation that does not need to be rebuilt every year. Mistakes become less costly. Missed plantings are not catastrophic. The system becomes forgiving. Over time, confidence replaces urgency. This shift restores a quiet form of independence. Fewer purchases are required. Fewer emergencies arise. Food production becomes less exposed to market swings and supply disruptions. What was once routine, plants returning without being asked, begins to feel possible again. The perennial vegetables that built medieval food security were not perfect solutions, but they were durable ones. They did not promise abundance without effort. They promised continuity. They made it possible to plan beyond a single season and to pass food systems forward rather than starting over. What was lost when these crops disappeared was not just a list of plants. It was a way of thinking about time, effort, and responsibility. Food security was once something grown slowly and protected carefully, not something purchased repeatedly and managed endlessly. As modern systems strain under their own complexity, the value of endurance is becoming clear again. Perennial vegetables matter now for the same reason they mattered centuries ago. They reduce dependency, stabilize production, and allow effort to accumulate rather than reset. Food security does not begin each spring. It is built over years. The medieval world understood that truth. Remembering it does not mean returning to the past. It means reclaiming a principle that still works.